The Battle of Kursk, the day the tanks collided. This was supposed to be Germany's last chance to win the war. Instead, it became the day over 6,000 tanks faced each other in the largest armored battle in human history. What happened next would change everything. July 1943, the Eastern Front. Two massive armies are about to collide in a battle so intense that the ground itself would shake for miles around. The Germans called it Operation Citadel. The Soviets knew it was coming, and they were ready. This is the story of Kursk, where more tanks fought in a single day than most countries had in their entire military. This is the story of men, machines, and the moment Nazi Germany's fate was sealed. Let me take you back to early 1943. Germany had a problem. Actually, Germany had a lot of problems, but right now, we're talking about one massive problem on the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the German war machine had taken a serious hit, not just in terms of men and equipment, but in morale and momentum. For the first time since the war started, German soldiers were looking over their shoulders, wondering if they could actually lose this thing. But there was a bulge in the Soviet lines near a city called Kursk. Picture a huge piece of Soviet territory sticking out into German-held land, like a thumb jutting out on a map. The Germans looked at this and saw an opportunity. If they could attack from the north and south simultaneously, they could trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in a pocket, cut them off, destroy them, and maybe, just maybe, regain the initiative in the east. Hitler was desperate for a victory, something big, something that would make headlines and convince his allies that Germany still had what it took to win. The German High Command began planning Operation Citadel, and they were going to throw everything they had at it. And I mean everything. The Germans assembled over 900,000 men, nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, about 2,000 aircraft. They brought their newest and most powerful tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, machines that could knock out Soviet tanks from distances the Soviets could only dream of shooting from. On paper, this force was absolutely devastating. But here's the thing about 1943 that made it different from 1941 or 1942. The Soviets had learned, they had adapted, and more importantly, they had spies everywhere. Soviet intelligence knew about Operation Citadel almost as soon as the Germans started planning it. Stalin knew when the attack would come. He knew where it would come from, and he had time to prepare. The Soviets didn't just prepare, they went absolutely crazy with their preparations. They built defensive lines that were insane. We're talking about belts of defenses that went 150 miles deep in some places, millions of mines, anti-tank ditches, trenches, bunkers, artillery positions. They turned the Kursk salient into a fortress, and they didn't stop there. Behind those defensive lines, the Soviets assembled their own massive force, over 1.3 million men, more than 3,000 tanks, over 2,000 aircraft. They were ready not just to defend, but to counterattack and push the Germans back. The stage was set for the biggest tank battle the world had ever seen. July 5, 1943, 3:30 in the morning. The Germans are about to launch their offensive when suddenly, Soviet artillery opens up. Thousands of guns, all firing at once. The Soviets knew the exact time the Germans were planning to attack, so they fired first, hoping to catch German units while they were still assembling. It was chaos. German soldiers who were supposed to be moving into their attack positions were suddenly diving for cover as shells rained down on them. But the Germans had dealt with Soviet artillery before. They weathered the storm, and at dawn, they began their own bombardment. What followed was a sound unlike anything most of these men had ever heard. Thousands of German guns firing, hundreds of aircraft bombing Soviet positions, and then the tanks started rolling forward. From the north, Field Marshal Walter Model led the Ninth Army. His job was to punch through the Soviet defenses and drive south toward Kursk. He had some of the best units in the German army, including the 2nd Panzer Army with dozens of the new Tiger tanks. Those Tigers were monsters. They had 88mm guns that could punch through Soviet armor like it was paper. Their armor was so thick that most Soviet anti-tank guns couldn't even scratch them from the front. When German crews climbed into those machines, they felt invincible. But the Soviets had prepared something special for these new German tanks. The first day of the northern attack, the Germans made progress. They pushed forward several miles, destroying Soviet defensive positions, knocking out tanks, capturing ground. But it was slow, much slower than they had hoped. Every time they overran one Soviet defensive line, there was another one behind it, and another, and another. The Soviets had learned from their earlier defeats. They weren't throwing their tanks directly at the Germans anymore. Instead, they were using them in small groups, hiding them in prepared positions, letting the Germans come to them. German tanks would roll forward, thinking they had broken through, and suddenly Soviet tanks would pop up from concealed positions and hit them from the side. And those mines. The Germans were hitting mines constantly. Engineers would clear a path, tanks would roll through, and then more mines would appear. The Soviets had buried so many mines that in some sectors, there were over 2,500 mines per mile of front. Tank crews were terrified of them because hitting a mine could blow the tracks off your tank, leaving you stranded and vulnerable. By the end of the first day, Model's forces had pushed maybe 5 miles. They had lost dozens of tanks. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded, and they were nowhere near breaking through. The Germans kept pushing, July 6th, July 7th, July 8th. Each day they would attack, and each day they would make some progress. But it was grinding, brutal, exhausting work. The new Panther tanks, which were supposed to be Germany's answer to Soviet T-34s, kept breaking down. Their engines would overheat. Their transmissions would fail. Some would catch fire for no apparent reason. Out of the 200 Panthers that started the battle, only a handful were still running by the second week. But in the south, things were different. General Hermann Hoth commanded the 4th Panzer Army in the south, and he had the strongest force. This was where Germany had concentrated its best units, including the elite SS Panzer Corps. These weren't just regular German soldiers. These were SS divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. Each one was equipped with Tiger tanks, and their commanders were experienced, aggressive, and determined to break through. The southern attack started the same way as the northern one, with Soviet artillery trying to disrupt German preparations, followed by a massive German bombardment. But Hoth's forces had more success early on. They punched through the first Soviet defensive lines relatively quickly and started pushing deeper. The Soviets threw everything they had at them. Anti-tank guns firing from every direction, infantry with anti-tank rifles, tank destroyer units, regular tank units. But the Germans kept coming. The Tigers were living up to their reputation, destroying Soviet tanks from ranges where the Soviets couldn't even shoot back effectively. On July the 6th, German forces in the south advanced about 12 miles. On July 7th, they pushed even further. Soviet commanders were starting to worry. If the Germans broke through completely, they could encircle massive numbers of Soviet troops, and all those defensive preparations would be for nothing. That's when the Soviet High Command made a decision. They were going to commit their reserves. Specifically, they were going to send in the 5th Guards Tank Army. This wasn't just any unit. This was one of the Soviet Union's most powerful armored formations. Over 800 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Soviets had been holding them back, waiting for the right moment to throw them into battle. And that moment had come. The Soviets ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army to move toward a small town called Prokhorovka. That's where they would hit the advancing German forces. That's where they would stop Operation Citadel. That's where the real battle would happen. July 11th, 1943. Both sides knew something big was coming. German reconnaissance had spotted large Soviet tank formations moving toward Prokhorovka. Soviet scouts reported that German SS divisions were concentrating in the same area. Everyone knew that the next day would be decisive. German tank crews spent the evening maintaining their vehicles, loading ammunition, trying to get some sleep. Some wrote letters home, though they didn't know if those letters would ever be sent. The Tigers and Panthers were fueled and ready. The plan was simple. Push through the Soviet forces at Prokhorovka, break their defensive line completely, and drive toward Kursk itself. On the Soviet side, tank crews were receiving their orders. Attack at dawn. Close the distance with the Germans as quickly as possible. Don't let them use their superior range. Get in close where Soviet T-34s could be effective. Commanders told their men that this battle would determine the fate of the war. Some believed it. Others just wanted to survive until tomorrow night. The 5th Guards Tank Army had about 850 tanks. Most were T-34s, the workhorse of the Soviet armored forces. These tanks were good, reliable, and fairly well armored, but their 76mm guns struggled against Tigers from the front. Soviet tankers knew that if they wanted to knock out a Tiger, they had to hit it in the side or rear where the armor was thinner. That meant getting close, really close. The Germans had fewer tanks in the area, maybe 600 or so, but many of them were Tigers and Panthers. Plus, they had the advantage of defensive positions. They could let the Soviets come to them, pick them off at range, and use their superior optics and guns to dominate the battlefield. At least, that was the plan. Nobody on either side really understood just how chaotic the next day would be. Dawn, July 12, 1943, near Prokhorovka. The largest tank battle in history is about to begin. Soviet tanks started their engines, hundreds of T-34s all at once. The sound was incredible, like thunder rolling across the steppe. Tank commanders gave the order to advance, and the entire formation started moving forward, kicking up huge clouds of dust. The Germans saw them coming. Officers shouted orders. Tank gunners loaded armor-piercing rounds. Everyone braced for impact. At first, the Germans did exactly what they were supposed to do. They opened fire at long range. Tiger tanks started knocking out T-34s from over a mile away. Soviet tanks would explode, catch fire, or just stop moving as German shells punched through their armor. It looked like it was going to be a massacre. But the Soviets didn't stop. They didn't slow down. They just kept coming. Soviet commanders had ordered their tankers to close the distance as fast as possible. That meant driving straight at the Germans, even while taking casualties. Some T-34 crews watched as the tanks next to them exploded, but they kept going. They had to get close. That was the only chance they had. German gunners were reloading as fast as they could. They'd fire, hit a Soviet tank, reload, find another target, fire again. But there were so many Soviet tanks that it didn't matter how many they destroyed. More kept coming. And then the Soviets reached close range. Suddenly, German tankers who had been picking off Soviet tanks from a distance found themselves surrounded. T-34s were everywhere, firing from all directions. Soviet tanks would drive right up to German positions, sometimes ramming German tanks when they couldn't get a clear shot. The battlefield became absolute chaos. Tanks were firing at point-blank range. Crews were bailing out of burning vehicles, trying to run for cover while machine guns and cannons fired all around them. The dust and smoke were so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Tankers couldn't tell friend from enemy half the time. They'd see a shape through the smoke, fire at it, and only afterward realize what they had hit. Some German Tigers found themselves fighting multiple Soviet tanks at once. They'd knock out one T-34, turn to face another, and get hit in the side by a third. Soviet tankers realized that if they worked together, they could overwhelm even the mighty Tigers. One Soviet tank commander later described it as a dance of death. Tanks circling each other, firing, trying to get behind one another, all while more tanks kept joining the fight. There was no front line anymore, no rear area, just machines and men trying to kill each other in a space that was maybe 5 miles across. The fighting lasted all day. Hour after hour of tanks shooting, burning, exploding. By midday, the battlefield was covered in wrecked vehicles. Some were still burning. Others were just hulks of twisted metal. Injured crewmen who had escaped their tanks tried to find cover, but there was nowhere safe to go. Artillery from both sides kept firing into the mess, not even sure what they were hitting anymore. German tank crews who had felt so confident in their Tigers that morning were starting to panic. These machines that were supposed to be invincible were being destroyed. Not because they weren't good tanks, but because they were outnumbered and surrounded. Soviet tankers were literally driving their T-34s into Tigers, using their own tank as a weapon when their guns weren't enough. By late afternoon on July 12th, both sides were exhausted, but the Soviets had accomplished something crucial. They had stopped the German advance. The SS Panzer Corps, which was supposed to break through Soviet lines and drive toward Kursk, was stuck fighting for its life at Prokhorovka. German commanders realized they weren't going to achieve a breakthrough. Not here, not today, maybe not at all. And then Hitler made a decision that would end Operation Citadel permanently. On July 10th, the Allies had invaded Sicily. Italy, Germany's main ally, was in trouble. Hitler was getting reports that the Italian military was collapsing, that Mussolini might fall, that Germany would have to send troops to defend Italy. He couldn't afford to keep losing men and tanks in Russia when he needed them elsewhere. On July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The offensive was over. The Germans would withdraw to their starting positions and go on the defensive. For the first time in the war, Germany had launched a major offensive and failed to achieve any of its objectives. They hadn't encircled Soviet forces. They hadn't captured Kursk. They hadn't regained the initiative. Instead, they had lost hundreds of tanks, thousands of men, and most importantly, they had lost the ability to dictate the course of the war in the East. The Soviets, on the other hand, had won. Not in the traditional sense. They had lost more tanks and men than the Germans at Prokhorovka, but they had stopped the German offensive. They had held their ground, and now they were ready to counterattack. The Battle of Prokhorovka specifically, and the Battle of Kursk overall, cost both sides dearly. Soviet losses were staggering. They lost somewhere between 800,000 to 900,000 men killed, wounded, or captured during the entire Kursk campaign. Over 6,000 tanks were destroyed or damaged. But here's the difference. The Soviets could replace those losses. Soviet factories were churning out thousands of tanks every month. New soldiers were being trained constantly. The Soviet Union, despite suffering horrific casualties, was getting stronger. Germany couldn't replace its losses. Those experienced tank crews who died at Prokhorovka, they were irreplaceable. Those Panthers and Tigers that were destroyed, Germany didn't have the industrial capacity to build them fast enough. Every tank lost at Kursk was one less tank available to defend against the Soviets later. After Kursk, the Germans never launched another major offensive in the East. From July 1943 onward, it was all retreat and defense. The Soviets would keep pushing, liberating territory, driving toward Germany itself. Prokhorovka was more than just a tank battle. It was a symbol. It showed that the Soviet military had learned how to fight the Germans effectively. Soviet commanders had figured out how to use their advantages, numbers, determination, willingness to take casualties, to overcome German technological superiority. German soldiers who survived Kursk knew they had lost more than just a battle. They had lost the war. It would take 2 more years of fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany was going to lose, and Kursk was the moment when everyone knew it. Let me tell you what it was really like to be inside a tank during Prokhorovka, because movies and video games don't capture how absolutely terrifying it was. First, imagine being inside a metal box in the middle of July. It's hot. Not uncomfortable hot, but I might pass out hot. Tank interiors could reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit even before the battle started. Now add the heat from the engine, the heat from the gun firing, the stress of combat, and you've got crews who were drenched in sweat, struggling to breathe, trying to focus while their bodies were shutting down from heat exhaustion. The noise inside a tank was deafening. The engine was screaming. The gun would fire and the sound would make your ears ring even with hearing protection. The radio was crackling with messages. Empty shell casings were clanging around inside the turret. And outside, you could hear the muffled sounds of other tanks firing, shells hitting your armor, explosions going off nearby. Visibility was awful. Tank periscopes and vision slits gave you a tiny, limited view of what was happening outside. The commander might have a better view from his cupola, but even then, with all the dust and smoke, you couldn't see much. Tank crews at Prokhorovka described it as trying to fight while looking through a keyhole. You'd catch glimpses of other tanks, see muzzle flashes, spot movement, but you never had a clear picture of what was actually happening. And then there was the fear. The constant, gnawing fear that the next second might be your last. Every time you heard a loud clang on your armor, you didn't know if that was a shell bouncing off, or if it had penetrated and you just hadn't died yet. Tankers knew that if their tank got hit and caught fire, they had maybe 10 seconds to get out before the ammunition cooked off and the whole thing exploded. That's why tank crews always kept the hatches slightly open during combat, even though it was against regulations. They wanted a way out if things went bad. Soviet tank crews had it even worse than the Germans in some ways. T-34s were cramped. The commander also had to act as the gunner, which meant he was trying to command the tank and fight it at the same time. German tanks had dedicated gunners, which made them more effective, but Soviet crews made up for it with aggression and numbers. The smell inside tanks during and after battle was something crewmen never forgot. Burning metal, cordite from fired shells, diesel fumes, and if your tank had been hit, the smell of burning rubber, melting paint, and sometimes worse things. Crews who survived often said the smell was what haunted them years later, more than the sights or sounds. Behind all these numbers and tactical discussions, there were real people. Young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who found themselves in this hell. Soviet tank crews knew their life expectancy was measured in weeks once they entered combat. They'd seen too many tanks explode, too many friends die, but they kept fighting because they believed they were defending their homeland. German troops had invaded their country, killed their families, destroyed their cities. This was personal for Soviet soldiers in a way it never was for the Germans. German tankers at Kursk were starting to have doubts. Some of them had been fighting since 1941. They had seen Germany go from victory to victory, and now they were watching it all fall apart. They were still fighting because they were soldiers, because their comrades depended on them, because they didn't know what else to do. But the confidence was gone. There are stories from Prokhorovka that show both the brutality and the strange humanity of war. Soviet tankers pulling injured German crewmen from burning tanks, even though they had been trying to kill each other minutes before. German soldiers sharing water with Soviet prisoners, even though they were supposed to be enemies. Small moments of decency in the middle of absolute chaos. And then there were the moments that showed how savage the fighting was. Tank crews running over injured men because they couldn't see them through the dust and didn't have time to stop. Crewmen burning to death inside their tanks, screaming while their friends listened helplessly. The aftermath of the battle, when soldiers had to walk through fields of destroyed tanks and collect the remains of the dead. One Soviet soldier described walking across the Prokhorovka battlefield after the fighting ended. He said you couldn't take 10 steps without seeing a dead body or a destroyed tank. The smell was overwhelming. Some tanks were still smoldering days later, and everywhere there were personal items scattered around, letters from home, photographs, medals, all the things soldiers carried with them that now belonged to men who would never go home. Kursk wasn't just about Prokhorovka. The tank battle there gets all the attention because it was so dramatic, but the entire operation was massive. In the north, Model's 9th Army had been ground down trying to break through Soviet defenses. They had made it maybe 10 miles in a week of fighting before Hitler called off the offensive. All those casualties, all those destroyed tanks, for 10 miles of territory that they would give back anyway when they retreated. After the Germans called off their offensive, the Soviets immediately launched their own counterattacks. They hit the German forces while they were still recovering from Operation Citadel. The Soviets recaptured Orel in early August and Kharkov later that month. They pushed the Germans back, liberated more Soviet territory, and kept the pressure on. From that point on, the Eastern Front was one long retreat for Germany. There would be moments where German forces would stabilize a line, maybe launch a small counterattack, but the overall trend was clear. The Soviets were advancing, and Germany was running out of ways to stop them. Some historians argue that Kursk was the real turning point of the war in the East, more so than Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, Germany lost an army. At Kursk, Germany lost its ability to win. After Stalingrad, Germany could still hope to achieve a stalemate or a negotiated peace. After Kursk, there was no hope left. It was just a matter of how long it would take the Soviets to reach Berlin. Let's talk about the machines for a minute, because the technology at Kursk represented a major shift in tank warfare. The German Tiger tank was incredible on paper. It had an 80mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank from distances of over a mile. Its armor was so thick that most Allied anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate it from the front. German crews loved the Tiger because it made them feel safe. But the Tiger had problems. It was heavy, over 50 tons, which meant it was slow and it broke down constantly. It guzzled fuel, which was a huge problem for Germany as the war went on. And it was complicated to build, which meant Germany could never produce them in the numbers they needed. Germany built about 1,300 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviets built over 60,000 T-34s. The Panther was supposed to be Germany's answer to the T-34. It was faster than the Tiger, better armored than earlier German tanks, and had a powerful 75mm gun. But at Kursk, Panthers were a disaster. They had been rushed into production, and it showed. Engines caught fire. Transmissions failed. Some Panthers broke down before they even reached the battlefield. The T-34 wasn't as sophisticated as German tanks. Its gun wasn't as powerful. Its optics weren't as good, but it was reliable, easy to produce, and good enough to get the job done. More importantly, the Soviets had figured out how to use them effectively. Instead of trying to match German tanks one-on-one, they would swarm them with numbers. Soviet tank tactics at Kursk showed how much they had learned. Early in the war, Soviet tanks would attack in neat formations that made them easy targets. By 1943, they were using terrain, coordinating with infantry and artillery, and concentrating forces at decisive points. They had studied German tactics and adapted. After Kursk, Germany's options on the Eastern Front were all bad. They could try to hold a defensive line, but the Soviets would just concentrate forces and break through. They could try to trade space for time, retreating and making the Soviets pay for every mile. But that meant giving up territory and resources. They could try to negotiate a peace, but Stalin wasn't interested in negotiations. Hitler's decision to call off Operation Citadel was one of those moments where you can see the whole war shifting. If he had committed to the offensive, kept pushing at Kursk regardless of what was happening in Italy, maybe the outcome would have been different. Probably not, but maybe. Instead, he tried to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, and Germany didn't have the resources to do that successfully. The Soviets, meanwhile, had finally figured out how to fight a modern war. Their industry was outproducing Germany. Their tactics had improved dramatically. Their commanders had learned from their mistakes, and they had something Germany didn't have: strategic depth. They could afford to lose battles and still win the war. Germany couldn't. Western allies were watching what happened at Kursk very carefully. They saw that the Soviet Union was capable of defeating Germany without much help. That changed the dynamics of the alliance. It meant that when the Americans and British finally opened the Second Front with D-Day in 1944, they were racing to get to Germany before the Soviets took everything. Kursk proved that Germany could be beaten. It showed that the Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible in 1940 and 1941, was mortal after all. And it gave the Soviet Union the confidence and momentum to keep pushing all the way to Berlin. The Battle of Kursk, and specifically Prokhorovka, became legendary in Soviet history. It was the moment when the Red Army proved it could stand up to the best the Germans had and win. Soviet propaganda celebrated it as a great victory, which it was, even though the cost was horrific. For Germany, Kursk was a disaster that they tried to forget. After the war, German generals would write memoirs talking about how they were winning until Hitler interfered, how they could have broken through if only they had more time, how the whole thing was doomed from the start because of poor planning. Basically, they looked for anyone to blame except themselves. Tank crews who survived Prokhorovka on both sides rarely talked about it. It was too traumatic. The things they saw, the friends they lost, the sheer chaos of that day, most of them just wanted to forget. Some would wake up decades later with nightmares about being trapped in a burning tank. The battlefield itself remained scarred for years after the war. Farmers would plow up tank parts, unexploded shells, and human remains decades later. Some areas had so much metal in the ground that compasses wouldn't work properly. The Soviets eventually built monuments at Prokhorovka, but the real memorial is the ground itself, still marked by what happened there. Military historians study Kursk because it represented a turning point in armored warfare. It showed that massed tank formations could still be decisive in the age of modern weapons. It proved that numbers still mattered, even when your enemy had better technology. And it demonstrated that no tank, no matter how powerful, was invincible when surrounded and outnumbered. The Battle of Kursk was Germany's last real chance to regain the initiative in the East, and they failed. Operation Citadel was supposed to trap Soviet armies, shorten German defensive lines, and prove that Germany still had the strength to win. Instead, it turned into a grinding battle of attrition that Germany couldn't afford. Prokhorovka was the dramatic climax of that battle. The day when over 1,500 tanks collided in a space measuring just a few miles across. It was chaos, brutality, and desperation all mixed together. Both sides lost heavily, but the Soviets achieved their objective. They stopped the German offensive. After Kursk, the war in the east became a story of Soviet advance and German retreat. There would be more battles, more casualties, more destroyed tanks. But the momentum had shifted permanently. Germany was going to lose, and everyone knew it. The men who fought at Prokhorovka showed courage on both sides. They climbed into their metal coffins knowing they might not survive the day. They kept fighting even when the situation seemed hopeless. They did what soldiers have always done. They followed orders, supported their comrades, and tried to survive. In the end, Kursk proved something important about war. It's not just about having the best weapons or the best trained soldiers. It's about who can sustain losses and keep fighting. Germany had better tanks, better trained crews, and better tactical doctrine. But the Soviet Union had more men, more tanks, and the will to absorb horrific casualties to defend their homeland. That's why Kursk mattered. That's why Prokhorovka became legendary. It was the day the tide truly turned, and nothing was ever the same after that. Subscribe for more stories from history's greatest battles.